Nice to meet you. My name is Hide. Today, allow me to talk to you about the process for design docs. I joined in 2019 in April, and I'm currently a software engineer in the iOS team. Nice to meet you all. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the design doc, but I don't think it will be a full hour, so I think we'll end a little quickly. Okay, so for those of you who have never written a design doc before, let me start out with what it exactly is. So a design doc is a historical document that outlines the technical specs about a feature or system. And specifically, I'd like to talk about what a design doc is like in Mercari. So compared to other companies or what information you might see online, it might be slightly different from that. So please note that this is a very specific description to Mercari. Usually at Mercari, we create a design doc before we start with development. It's okay to create a design doc after development. I still think there's meaning to it, but in my experience in the teams I've been, generally speaking, we've written design docs before development starts. So what do we write in a design doc? What sort of changes are made to a feature or a system? There's no need to write specific code in the doc itself, but if somebody can read the design doc and understand a summary of the changes that are being made, it will, that is its purpose. Next. So how do we write a design doc? Before that, I'd like to talk about why. Why do we need a design doc and what are the merits of having one? First, I put down transfer knowledge. So we want to be able to share knowledge with others. So let's say you're investigating something in order to write this design doc. And you have some sort of knowledge, maybe you've increased your knowledge in a certain area. And so you want to make sure that it's easy to understand for those of others who may not have the same information as you. The second point, the second reason would be you want to improve the quality of your development by getting feedback. For example, you may be developing using a code base that you don't usually work on. Maybe you need more domain knowledge. And so then you can ask for feedback from others who may have more expertise. So maybe someone within your team or outside of the team who knows the specs or knows the code better. And so even if you are in charge of development, before actually starting with development, you can actually receive feedback from others. And that can also help you receive more information and create a space for discussion with others prior to starting with development. The other point is you can use the design doc to find potential errors before they actually happen and you start with development. So other teams can share their experience within the design docs, adding a comment or sharing their feedback, and they help you point out these errors. The fourth point is that a design doc can help you clarify your thoughts. There may be areas that you've been able to think through and areas that you haven't been able to think through yet. And by writing them down, you may be able to make them real and more feasible in your head. And make sure that you can clarify the issues or questions you may have in your mind. Of course, it takes more time in order to write down a design, but overall, your development process may be speedier because you've been able to clarify the process. Previously, I asked some of my team members why they write design docs or what the merits they feel are for having a design doc. And the comments that I received at that time is that, of course, it's a document that helps with historical evidence, but at the same time, it's a document that can be used for communication. So the flow of writing a document and then receiving a review is important because it allows you to get a lot of valuable feedback. And so I think this is an important aspect of a design doc too. So since you're explaining how you're thinking about doing an implementation, uh, because this information is shared in the document, it allows you to improve your code review quality too. Finally, something that I heard from other teammates is that sometimes code bases are owned by another team, and say you become the reviewer. And in those cases, you may have smaller pull requests that are shared with you, but sometimes you want a roadmap to understand the entire feature or the entire system. You want to look at the big picture of where your changes lie. And in those cases, if there's a design doc and it's shared with other members or people in other teams, then it gives people the big picture of what changes are being made within this pull request and what sort of changes are going to happen in the future for the entirety of the system. That allows for you to create more alignment with other teams and to create a better understanding in terms of technical details. So before architecture or setting up the design, you don't want to think about the design while writing the code. Having a process clearly defined beforehand, you want to make sure that the development process itself doesn't need a lot of edits. So that is a quick summary of what a design doc is and why we might want a design doc. So when do we write a design doc? So this is just a regular product development flow, but let's say first a PM discusses a new plan for a product, thinks of a new idea, and then at that point, we understand what the specs should be for the product, what kind of actions will be needed, and then finally, after that is when a design doc would be created. Unless we know the specs, then we can't create a design doc. So those need to be determined before. So once the design doc is reviewed, then approved, you can start with development. So by going through this process, you can get some of the merits or the advantages that I just discussed earlier. So what's within a design doc? Or what do we do in a design doc? So first, we start with the discussion. So for example, we want to create a new feature. In that case, let's say this function is quite complicated or it's going to be quite a big development process. So the team may just have a discussion and decide a design doc may be necessary. In that case, maybe the team will decide to create an actual design doc and we'll move on to the next section. And of course, we create a design doc before writing code. Sometimes we need to create a prototype. And so while we're prototyping, we may be creating a design doc. So when do we need a prototype? For example, let's say we want to implement a certain type of feature, but we don't know how it will work in terms of performance. And if we don't know what it'll actually look like in terms of performance, if you can't write a very specific design doc. So in those cases, maybe you want to have a bare minimum POC. Once that's determined, then maybe you want to write your design doc after that. So that may be the case. It's rare, but it may happen. So that's what I mean here by writing code or the design doc while prototyping. And then I discussed this earlier, but after that, you should have your design doc reviewed. And you would ask people who have insight into the domain or the area that you are, who have an expertise in this area, and they can help you with feedback. Oftentimes, you can find discrepancies in the design doc, or there may be areas that you may have missed. And so then you may have to have a discussion regarding changing the specs, or perhaps according to the mobile platform, iOS, Android, you might have to change some of the contents. So you can have a discussion again, might go back to the discussion section during the review, and then you might update the design doc and then review it again. So we go through this process. Once you have the document reviewed and it's approved, then after that, you start coding. So this process is very similar to our code writing and reviewing process and then merging the changes. It's very close to this cycle. And by doing this process beforehand, when writing a design doc, then when we want to implement some high level features, or let's say if there are differences in understanding or decision making processes, then if we can go through this discussion during the design doc process, it's easier to fix these areas rather than going back after writing the code. We can eliminate a certain amount of cost, which is why we go through this design doc process. This is a quick explanation about the process. Next, I'd like to talk about the lifespan. So design docs are considered a historical document, but the main objective of looking at a design doc is to understand why certain decisions were made in the past. So on the second point, I wrote, don't update design docs, but what I mean by that is this design doc doesn't need to have the newest specs explained. I don't mean you can't update them at all, but I mean that they don't always have to be constantly updated in the constantly new situation. So they are a historical document that allows you to understand why decisions were made, why this sort of code was written, why this decision was made. And so looking back and being able to track those things are important. So let's say there's certain code and you want to change it. Then maybe you want to look back on why certain decisions on the code was made in the past. Then you can understand through tracking that you can make certain changes and it would be okay. So there's no need to have constantly renew the design doc, but use it to understand historical decisions. When there are changes, we would like you can write a new design doc. Let's say there are different versions, version 1 and version 2 of a certain spec or a system. It may depend on the type of change that is made, but let's say the version 1 design doc, you don't want to update the version 1 design doc, but you want to just create a new version 2 design doc and then link the old version 1 design doc. So that way you can look at the historical decisions or historical record of what was decided in the past. So that is the ideal situation. So that's what we mean by saying it's a historical document. So what are non-historical documents then? This would be Confluence or onboarding wikis. So for example, onboarding wikis or information, it explains, for example, the development process. But that kind of information, it's not helpful if we have past historical documents. We want the most updated versions so that we can constantly look at the most updated version. So I think the same page, like the onboarding wiki, should just constantly be updated into the newest version. For Confluence as well, the specs that are listed there, as long as the specs are the newest, most updated version, that's all we need. And so that's why Confluence and onboarding wikis are not considered historical documents, but design documents are designed to be historical documents. So that's the main objective for this change. Interpreter switch.
Okay, next. From here on, I would like to talk about how to write a design doc. In Mercari, Many teams are writing a design doc. And what is hard is, depending on the team, they use different templates. Therefore, for my team, we write the class name and describe in detail what are the changes. But when we look at other teams' design doc, that's not always the case. They have different templates. For example, if it's an API migration, they write and describe the architecture and just list up the components that will be changed. So which template to use will differ depending on the case. It will also differ depending on the feature and team. And I'm not quite sure which team you belong to. So please ask your team members whether you can use this template or not. But I would like to show you some examples. So I have a specific example and where to look for good design docs. So if you take a look at the first link, this is just one template, the template that was used by the mobile team. And if you quickly look through it, we have the title, date, and then the author. And where it says reviewers, you can write down the names which you would like to review this document, and also the goal of the development. And where it says reference, it is the specifications related to this task, or if you are developing iOS and Android at the same time, you can link the other platform. Or if it's a microservice, you could also paste relevant documents related to that microservice and briefly describe the specification. And for example, here for iOS, you can write the classes and the changes that you'll be making, so that you write down here. Next is dependencies. So let's say when you are going to be introducing a third-party library, what are the libraries that you're going to be including? For test plan, so basically you'll be writing about how it's going to be covered through the feature flag. But just as an example, let's say if the way you do the test is complicated, or if you need like a special account. If you need to prepare a special account, and the information that you need to do that test will be written here. Next is release plan. I did touch on this a little bit earlier, but if you have a plan to, for example, release version 1 and version 2, then you can write here the timeline for version 1 and timeline for version 2. And as described here, you should also write down the feature flag related information here. So this is the template for the mobile side. Okay, next is Teams. Let me just quickly explain about this page. So as I have mentioned, each team has their own process. And basically, before the implementation, design doc is written. And other engineers and tech leads will approve the design doc. And the template will also differ depending on the team. And some teams say they do not need a design doc. And where it says individual, if the team does not require a design doc, even though the team does not require a design doc, if you want to verbalize your thoughts or document the design, then you can write your own design doc.